The Brazilian Grand Prix provided Drive to Survive with an entire season's worth of content from just one race. I know that you've got a lot of questions, but where do we start? First of all, we get what everybody's been asking for all season. We wanted to see Verstappen and Hamilton racing each other again. Unfortunately, that ended after a single lap. I didn't really expect it to go any differently, but let's have a look at the incident and see if the steward's decision made any sense. Then we had the end of the race, which was nothing but pure drama. Both Leclerc and Perez are asking the team for a little bit of help in order to score a few more points for the Drivers' Championship for P2. But both of their calls for help fall on deaf ears, well, sort of. We'll also have a look at what happened and the possibilities for championship points for a few different scenarios here. And then I'm going to give you my opinion on the biggest gossip of the weekend. Now, at the end of the race, Max didn't give the position back to Checo, allegedly because of something that happened months ago. In Monaco, did Perez deliberately crash in Q3 so that he could be ahead of Max on the grid? Now, I'll tell you what I see in the data, and you can make up your own mind. There's a lot going on in the data here, so let's get into the video. Before we get to all the dirt, let's talk about Mercedes' race. George Russell takes his first win, and honestly, he makes it look pretty easy. But I still want to know, as usual, would Lewis have been able to give him a run for his money? Russell seems pretty lucky this season, and Lewis hasn't really had much luck. Well, we didn't get to see this race because of the collision between Hamilton and Verstappen at the beginning of the race, so don't worry, I'll get back to the collision, but let's look at both of the Mercedes for now. To illustrate what happened during the race, I've got the race gaps plot here. This is basically, here's the virtual safety car, here's the safety car, here's the start of the race, here's the end of the race, and the distance between any 2 points is the distance between those two drivers on the track. Both of the Mercedes were on a two-stop soft, medium, soft race. Hamilton goes from P2 here back to P4 after the collision with Verstappen. He falls behind Sainz and then has to fight his way back up to the front. Now, Hamilton didn't need to fight Sainz because Sainz had to stop prematurely here. He had a visor tear off in his brake duct, which caused a fire, so he stopped, fixed the issue, came out behind, and changed tires. With Sainz out of the way, Hamilton is on the hunt for Perez and ultimately Russell. Now, Lewis looks to have awesome pace on the medium stint here, and he's making up quite a bit of time to George, but there's a little bit more to this. Towards the end of the race, there's the safety car caused by Norris. This bunches the whole field up, but Lewis doesn't really have an answer for George as he stays out of the DRS window here. But let's have a look back at some of the other aspects of this and see if Lewis would have been able to challenge Russell for the win. Here's the stints. We've got the lap times for both Hamilton and Russell. You can see Russell's lap times here on the soft. You can see this is where Lewis went back a couple positions. Now here's the medium stint. Russell just chilling, quite a bit slower lap times than Lewis. Lewis in the back making up quite a bit of ground, putting in lap times that are over half a second a lap faster for a large part of this stint. So let's talk about a few of the possibilities here. Russell knows that they are on roughly the same stop sequence and strategy, and he knows that he's got about a 10-second gap in hand. During this middle stint, Russell is probably just managing his tires and going as long as possible so that he doesn't get into any serious degradation on the final stint. They knew that they had to fit a soft at the end, and they wanted to make that stint as easy as possible. Now, Lewis is also trying to manage the stint as well, but he's got road to make up. He wants to at least get P2, if not be able to challenge George for the win. Now, the other scenario is that Lewis just had more pace on the medium, and if they had been 1-2 in this middle stint, maybe Lewis would have got past him. Everybody seemed to have a little bit of a different experience on the medium tire this weekend, but who knows? Honestly, in my opinion, you've just got to give it up for George this weekend. This was a super clean weekend, and as he took the sprint race win for the pole, and he dominated the race from the front. Mercedes have shown a trend of improving their pace since the summer break on the higher downforce circuits, and I think they might be back in business. If they go well at Abu Dhabi next week, hopefully this is a good sign that they have figured out everything in order to be competitive for the 2023 season. But Lewis didn't get a chance to properly challenge for the race win after his collision with Max. Now, given their history, it's not surprising to see these two colliding. Neither of them ever really want to give an inch, and neither of them want to back out. So let's talk about it. After the virtual safety car on the race restart, Verstappen goes for the overtake on Hamilton on the outside of turn 1. On the entry, Verstappen's ahead. By the apex, they're side by side. There's plenty of room here, and there's not too much to talk about. Now, from the apex of turn 1 to the apex of turn 2, Verstappen is now along the inside of Hamilton, setting up for turn 2. Verstappen's front wheel is at the middle of Hamilton's car. Now, before the apex of the corner, Verstappen is already on top of the apex curb, and they collide as both of them are turning in for the corner. My first impression was that Lewis didn't give Max enough space for this corner, but did he actually need to give him any space? So let's rewind a little bit. Back at Imola on the 19th of March, the FIA published this document, which is titled the FIA Formula One Driving Standards Guidelines. The goal of this document was to provide the stewards a little bit of a framework for stewarding decisions around collisions to make the rulings a bit more consistent. It specifies the criteria for both overtaking on the outside and inside of corners. It states in order for a car being overtaken to be required to give sufficient room to an overtaking car, a few things must happen. Number 1, a significant portion of the car alongside. The front tires need to be alongside the car no later than the apex of the corner. Number 2, it must be done in a safe and controlled manner. And number 3, it must be done while enabling the car to clearly remain within the limits of the track. So the fault was placed on Verstappen due to the fact that the stewards felt he had too much speed to even make the corner. So the part of the guideline which was not felt to be satisfied was the safe and controlled manner part. Based on previous rulings, he had clearly achieved the significant portion of the car alongside, but I really feel like his inability to make the corner had more to do with the fact that he was forced over the big sausage curb at the apex. Looking at the speed traces from the data from this lap and laps later in the race, there would have really been no issue with both of these drivers remaining on the track at the exit of turn 2. Lewis having the better line would have probably easily remained ahead of Max. But I think that the thing that most people can agree on is that if Mercedes are back in the fight next year, the last thing that we want to see is both Hamilton and Verstappen crashing into each other at every race. Something has to change. After the collision, Verstappen stops to change tires and front wing, and now elsewhere during the restart, Leclerc also collides with Norris and ends up completely stuffed into the wall, but he's able to drive away from it. Now I'm going to keep this part short so we can talk about the end of the race and even look at the Monaco qualifying as promised. After their shunts, neither Leclerc nor Verstappen have a chance of bringing home a race win, arguably. If Verstappen hadn't had the time penalty, he probably would have finished 4th. You can see the time penalty drops him out behind Leclerc here. That's what happens when you get a 5-second time penalty. But at the end of the race, Leclerc asks his pit wall, let me swap with Sainz so I can get P3 so I can score more points in order to secure P2 in the Drivers' Championship against Perez, to which Ferrari deny him completely. Now, I know it's P2 in the championship, but it's kind of brutal to ask a teammate to give up a podium as well, but so be it. Now, here's where the drama really kicks off. At the end of the race, Norris retires and causes the safety car. Now, this bunches the entire field back up. Perez restarts in 3rd on a medium. This is all that he had left. He had no softs left. Verstappen restarts in P10 on a soft tire, starts his charge back to the front of the race. On the restart, Max's engineer instructs him to go and take some points off Leclerc and Alonso. Perez is told not to fight Verstappen, and Verstappen will give back the place on the final lap if he's unable to get the positions off of Leclerc and Alonso. So this is a really good time to talk about the championship points. If Verstappen had finished P4 ahead of Leclerc, Leclerc would have finished this race with 288 points. Perez would have finished with 290. So Verstappen needs to overtake both Alonso and Leclerc in order to make this scenario work out. But on the final lap, Max hasn't overtaken either Alonso or Leclerc, holds his position, and doesn't return the place as instructed. With the finishing order, Leclerc and Perez go into Abu Dhabi with 290 points each. They're tied. Nothing bad ever happens going into the final race tied on points, obviously. Now, if Verstappen had let Perez back through, Perez would have been 2 points ahead of Leclerc with 292. Leclerc with 290. Going back to Ferrari, if Sainz had let Leclerc through, Leclerc would actually be 3 points ahead of Perez. So what happened with Perez and Verstappen? On the in-lap, when Max was asked what happened, Max replied, I told you already, don't ask me to do that again. I gave my reasons and I stand by them. At this point, I was completely confused. But why is this news just coming out now? Like, somebody had to have said something to the press this weekend, because we know as soon as the press get their hands on any gossip, they will ring it for everything it's worth, but it's just come out now. If you recall, at the end of the final qualifying session in Monaco, Perez made a mistake at turn 8. He spun his car at the apex of the corner just before the entry to the tunnel. It's coming out now as a rumor that this was no accident, but why would Perez crash himself out in qualifying when he did not even have provisional pole? He was only P3 at the time. Well, he was P3, and his teammate Verstappen was P4 just behind him. Pole position in Monaco is pretty much the only thing that matters, unless you're Ferrari this year. But anyway, if we go back and look at this, Rosberg did something very similar in 2014 when he accidentally locked up into turn 5. This was an absolute classic. I mean, this one was pretty harmless. He wobbles, locks up, goes down the escape road, no damage to his car, yellow flags, and he ruined Hamilton's bid for pole position. But in this instance, Perez actually sustained damage to his car from the spin at turn 8, and Sainz even crashes into him, which obviously wasn't planned. But this was months ago. Is this still a thing? Are they still hung up on this even if it actually happened? Even after Max has won the Drivers' Championship and the team has won the Constructors' Championship. Going back to Brazil, realistically, it costs Max absolutely nothing at this point to let Perez back through so that he can get a couple more points over Leclerc. But rather than trying to make sense of Brazil, let's look at the Monaco qualifying data. And there are a few things to take into consideration first when we're looking at this data. Number one, the sample rate of this data that we have access to is relatively low, so seeing details of throttle application can be actually pretty difficult. Now, number two, sometimes the lap distances are offset due to the way in which the data is processed. That means the alignment of corners and traces may not be great, but we can usually pick up on that pretty easily. Now, the third is the most important thing, which many novices or data enthusiasts might not understand at all. There's a lot of context missing from this data, which we cannot infer. For example, the brake data is on or off, which I rarely look at. We have no steering trace, we have no lateral acceleration or yaw rate. All of these things are very important to understand why or how a car crashed or something happened. Here is a comparison of Checo's lap 20, the 111.629 versus the dubious lap number 25 in questions. Here, we've got turns 5, 6, 7, and 8. You can see here's the car speed, here's the throttle, and here's the time delta. You can see here's turn 8 where Checo stops with the rear of the car into the barriers. Now, at turn 5 and 6, he's actually up on his fastest lap time, but from turn 7 to 8, he's losing a little bit of time here before the crash at turn 8. The thing that everybody else is looking at that looks super odd, you can see here just before the spin, he goes full throttle at the place at which he would usually start to ease into the throttle. You know, usually it takes him over 100 meters to go full throttle, and he goes full throttle instantly. Now, this is not a smoking gun to say that it was on purpose. As previously mentioned, we don't have a lot of the data such as steering, which is very important for analyzing things like this. But I went back and watched the video, and it doesn't really look like there's a big snap or anything strange here. And there are two things which are very odd to this about me. The first thing that's strange about this is into turn 8, he's about the same lap time as his previous lap. Now, there are plenty of corners left for him to prove on. Even if he breaks even at this point and loses maybe half a tenth at turn 8, why bend this lap into turn 8 just to hold on to P3? I mean, even risking car damage here seems a little bit crazy. The next thing that's a little bit odd to me is he loses control of the car going over 10 kilometers an hour slower into the entry of turn 8 than his previous fast lap. Typically, you might see somebody over pushing the entry and carrying too much speed and then losing it, but making a mistake while going 10 kilometers an hour slower into a 90 kilometer an hour corner is a little bit odd. So that leads me to look at some of his other previous fast laps in the session to gain a little bit of context. Here's lap 22, his other lap in Q3. Again, he was much faster on this fastest lap. The lap where he crashed, he brakes earlier, he's going slower into the corner. Yes, there could be a small offset here, but he's going slower into the corner. This doesn't make any sense that you would have a mistake going that much more slowly. Here's lap 17 from Q2. Again, turn 8 is slower on the entry. This just doesn't add up to me at all. Now, on one hand, I really don't see how he spins it here. He looks like he's instantly going on full throttle while he typically eases into the throttle here, and this is what everybody else is excited about. Honestly, that is strange. On the same hand, how do you lose the car when you're literally the slowest through this corner that you've been the entire session? That doesn't add up to me. Now, for the opposite side of this coin, bending it to secure P3 ahead of your teammate in P4? Really? I mean, you had an entire second half of a lap to find even more lap time. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And to be fair, throughout the weekend, Perez did tend to go quite well in Sector 3 here. So you guys can make up your own mind about this. There are probably only 2 or 3 people in the entire world that know the truth anyway. But I hope you enjoyed this video breakdown, and I'll see you guys next week after Abu Dhabi.